The crowd roared, a sea of thousands demanding blood, their voices echoing through stone walls that had witnessed horrors beyond imagination. The Colosseum was not just an arena, it was a machine of cruelty, where men, women, and entire peoples were thrown to the beasts for the amusement of Rome. But what happened here went far beyond sport. This was where racism, conquest, and power collided in the most brutal ways possible. Captives from distant lands, Africans, Asians, Celts, Jews, and countless others, were paraded as subhuman, stripped of dignity, and forced into spectacles designed to dehumanize them before their execution. Imagine standing at the center of that pit, blinded by sunlight, choking on the smell of blood, hearing the laughter of your oppressors as they waited to see how you would die. Some were burned alive, some were torn apart by lions, some were forced to kill each other in elaborate staged battles. These were not just games, they were acts of domination, designed to remind the conquered that they were nothing more than tools of entertainment. Tonight, you'll uncover the darkest secrets of Rome's arenas, acts so disturbing that even ancient historians whispered about them in horror, the forgotten victims of an empire that thrived on the suffering of the marginalized. This is not just history. It is the story of humanity's darkest hunger and the racial injustices carved into the foundations of civilization. The deeper we go, the more we'll see that Rome's greatest shame was not only its violence, but the way it turned racism into spectacle. The Roman Empire did not rise on philosophy, art, or politics alone. It rose on the backs of those it conquered, on the bones of the forgotten and the blood of the enslaved. To understand the arena, we must first step into the Rome that built it, a city that saw itself as eternal, invincible, and destined to rule the world. But behind the marble facades, beneath the golden statues of emperors, there was always a darker truth. Rome's greatness was fed by cruelty, and its power was defined by who it chose to dehumanize. In the first century of the empire, the city of Rome was already a place of overwhelming contrasts. On one side, endless wealth flowed into its heart. Exotic animals, gold, spices, silks, and slaves from every corner of the known world. Senators dined on delicacies from Africa and Asia, while poets praised the grandeur of Roman rule. On the other side, the conquered peoples who brought these riches were reduced to shadows. They were stripped from their homelands, branded as property, and forced into the lowest layers of society. This was not just slavery, it was systemic racism woven into the fabric of an empire. Romans prided themselves on civilization, but only for themselves. Anyone outside their culture, especially those with darker skin, foreign languages, or unfamiliar customs, was branded barbarian. This label did more than insult. It transformed entire peoples into objects, subhuman in the eyes of their oppressors. And nowhere was this hierarchy more visible than in the Colosseum. The Colosseum was not merely a building. It was a statement carved into stone and blood, a structure designed to remind every Roman citizen that they ruled over a world of captives. It was financed with the plunder of war, built by Jewish slaves after the destruction of Jerusalem, and designed to hold more than 50,000 spectators at once. Its towering arches and labyrinth of chambers below made it not just an arena, but a factory of death, where the empire's racial order was put on display for all to see. Before the games even began, the propaganda was clear. Murals and carvings throughout Rome showed prisoners of war kneeling in chains before emperors. Coins were minted with images of conquered nations, their peoples portrayed as bound, humiliated, or crawling at Rome's feet. The message was undeniable. Rome was supreme and everyone else was less than human. The arena gave life to this idea, turning it into public spectacle. When citizens filled the stands, they came not only to be entertained, but to be reassured of their superiority. Every death in the arena, every foreigner humiliated before the crowd, reminded Romans of their place at the top of the world. Racism was not hidden here. It was celebrated, normalized, and woven into entertainment so deeply that cruelty became tradition. But to see how far this cruelty could go, we must understand the mechanics of it. Rome's conquests were not random. Entire campaigns were designed to bring back prisoners for the games. In North Africa, hunters and soldiers captured lions, leopards, and elephants, not only for battle, but to symbolize the savagery of the lands Rome claimed to dominate. Alongside these animals came men, women, and children, people torn from their homes, transported across seas, and paraded as trophies of war. For the Romans, race and conquest were inseparable. Africans, in particular, were often associated with beasts and made to fight animals as if they themselves were no more than prey. Celts, with their tall frames and pale hair, were paraded as brutish savages to be tamed. Jews, despised for their resistance to Roman gods, were forced into mockery of their faith before execution. Each group was not only killed, but symbolically stripped of identity, turned into living props in Rome's theater of supremacy. Walking the streets of Rome during this time, you would feel the tension everywhere. Grand villas with mosaics of victory stood beside slave markets, where foreign tongues cried out in desperation. Murmurs of rebellion in distant provinces were met with swift brutality. And all the while the Colosseum loomed above, promising that no matter how far Rome stretched, every conquered soul would eventually bleed beneath its gaze. This empire of blood thrived on spectacle because spectacle was control. For the elites, it was a reminder of dominance. For the poor citizens, it was a distraction from their own suffering. Bread and circuses, designed to make them cheer instead of question. But for the enslaved and the oppressed, it was a death sentence, an unavoidable fate. Imagine the fear of those who entered Rome for the first time as captives, stripped of their clothing, chained at the ankles, forced to march past jeering crowds. The smell of incense and roasted meats filled the air, mocking their hunger. The marble steps they climbed led not to freedom, but into the belly of a machine designed to erase them. This was Rome's greatest contradiction, a civilization that praised law, philosophy, and beauty, yet reveled in brutality masked as entertainment. The empire had mastered the art of making violence look natural. It convinced its citizens that foreigners were less than human, that their deaths were not tragedies but celebrations, and by doing so, it ensured that racism was not only accepted but applauded. Part 1 of our journey ends here, with the image of Rome at its height, wealthy, powerful, and unshaken, yet rotting beneath the weight of its cruelty. The Colosseum is built. The crowds are ready, the captives are waiting in the dark chambers below. And soon the gates will open, unleashing acts of inhumanity so disturbing they would echo through history as Rome's greatest shame. Beneath the grandeur of Rome's marble palaces and triumphal arches lay a world hidden from the eyes of its proud citizens, the underground chambers where captives waited for their fate. The empire's reach was vast, stretching from the deserts of Africa to the mist-covered forests of Britain, and from every corner of this world, human lives were taken as spoils. These were not nameless crowds. They were people with families, languages, and cultures. But once seized by Rome, they became nothing more than flesh for spectacle. The first step of their descent into the Roman machine was capture. Armies stormed villages, burned homes, and chained survivors together for transport. Africans from the interior were dragged to the coast, shackled in long caravans. Celts were bound with iron collars, their tall bodies displayed as trophies of conquest. Jews, after the fall of Jerusalem, were marched by the tens of thousands through streets still stained with blood from the temple's destruction. The empire fed on conquest, and conquest fed the arenas. What began as war ended as humiliation. Rome staged grand parades called triumphs, where prisoners were forced to march behind victorious generals. Men, women, and even children were paraded in chains, mocked and jeered at by Roman citizens. Exotic clothing was stripped away and replaced with rags. Some were forced to wear costumes designed to ridicule their culture, Africans painted with animal skins, Celts adorned with false horns, Jews mocked with caricatures of their own religious symbols. These parades were not celebrations of victory alone. They were acts of public racism, designed to show that these peoples were no more than curiosities, inferior beings destined for servitude or death. Once the spectacle of the triumph ended, the captives' fates were decided. Some were sold in the sprawling slave markets of Rome. Others were condemned to labor in mines, their lives shortened to mere months, but thousands were selected for something far worse, the games of the arena. To be chosen was not an honor, nor even a chance at survival. It was a sentence, to die in ways so cruel that even death by slavery seemed merciful. The journey to the Colosseum was itself a slow stripping of humanity. Prisoners were marched into holding cells beneath the arena, a maze of stone corridors known as the hypogeum. Here they were catalogued not as people, but as inventory, recorded by ethnicity, age, and physical appearance. Roman scribes listed them coldly: Numidian, Jew, Gaul, Ethiopian. Their names were erased, replaced by categories that defined them only as outsiders. Racism became paperwork, bureaucracy that turned lives into labels. Inside these dark chambers, fear spread like disease. The air was damp, thick with the stench of animals kept in cages nearby. Lions roared in hunger, elephants groaned in chains, and prisoners huddled together, realizing they were part of the same performance. Different languages filled the air, yet all were united by terror. Imagine the silence when the iron gates clanged shut, sealing them in. Each captive knew that when those gates opened again, it would be to unleash them into the pit of death, where thousands of Romans waited to cheer. Preparation for the games was not training, it was degradation. Prisoners were starved so their bodies appeared weak and pitiful before the crowd. Some were forced to rehearse their roles in elaborate stagings of myths, where their deaths would symbolize the fall of monsters or traitors. Africans were paired with wild beasts to reinforce the stereotype that they were closer to animals than men. Jews were made to act in mocking plays that ridiculed their resistance to Rome's gods. Celts were forced into oversized armor, turned into caricatures of savagery before being slaughtered. Every detail was calculated for humiliation. Even execution was theater. When a Roman noble was executed, it was swift, beheading with a sword. But for the captives, death was dragged out to maximize spectacle. They were burned alive in reenactments of myths. They were tied to stakes and torn apart by dogs. They were crucified in rows, their suffering stretched into hours as the crowd watched. Racism was not an afterthought. It was the very script of the arena. Yet amid this horror, there were moments that revealed the humanity Rome tried to erase. Accounts from ancient historians speak of prisoners who refused to scream, who faced death in silence, denying the crowd the satisfaction of their suffering. Others sang songs in their native tongues as beasts approached, voices drowned out by roars but still defiant in their final moments. There were even whispers of men who clasped each other's hands, walking into death together, proving that no matter how Rome tried to strip them of dignity, solidarity survived. The Romans, however, turned even this into propaganda. Stories of brave barbarians were twisted into warnings. Resist Rome and this will be your fate. The crowd cheered not for courage but for domination. Every act of resistance was drowned beneath the weight of spectacle. Imagine sitting in the stands as a Roman citizen. To them, these were not tragedies, they were entertainments. They saw not individuals but categories: the African, the Jew, the barbarian. Racism had blinded them so deeply that they no longer recognized humanity in the captives before them. And so, when the gates opened and the first victims were pushed into the blinding light, the crowd did not weep, they roared. Part 2 of our journey closes here, in the suffocating darkness of the hypogeum. The captives wait, stripped of names, identities, and dignity. The drums echo above, the crowd grows restless, and the smell of blood seeps through the stone. Soon the gates will rise and Rome will reveal just how far it could go in transforming racism into spectacle. The morning of the games began not with silence, but with a festival. Rome treated executions as holidays, and the Colosseum became the beating heart of the city's darkest celebrations. From the streets leading to the great amphitheater, crowds poured in, dressed in bright tunics and carrying baskets of food. Children laughed, vendors shouted, and drums thundered through the air. To an outsider, it looked like a carnival, but beneath the laughter was an appetite for blood that nothing else could satisfy. The Colosseum itself towered over the crowd like a mountain of stone. Its arches stretched into the sky, gleaming, white under the sun, while banners of crimson and gold rippled in the wind. This was not just an arena, it was Rome's ultimate weapon of propaganda. Every block of marble, every statue of an emperor, every carving of chained captives reminded citizens of their dominance over the world. The building itself was a monument to racism, its very existence carved by the hands of slaves, and its purpose to degrade those considered inferior. As the people flooded inside, the vast bowl of the amphitheater came alive. 50,000 voices echoed against the stone. Senators in white robes sat in places of honor near the front. Above them, nobles reclined on cushioned seats, sipping wine as they waited. Higher still, the common citizens packed into the stone benches, buzzing with excitement. At the very top sat Rome's poorest, peering down at the stage far below. But no matter their class, all shared one thing: the anticipation of seeing foreigners, prisoners, and the enslaved reduced to nothing before their eyes. Beneath the arena, in the labyrinth of the hippodrome, the captives trembled in darkness. They heard the roar of the crowd above, a sound that felt less like voices and more like the growl of a beast waiting to devour them. Torches flickered against damp walls, shadows stretched across iron bars, and the smell of sweat and fear clung to every corner. Nearby cages rattled as lions and leopards paced in hunger. Elephants stomped restlessly, their chains clanging against the stone. Here humans and animals alike were prisoners, all reduced to props for the day's cruelty. When the games began, they did not start with killing. Rome was too skilled in spectacle to rush. The opening acts were designed to build excitement. Slowly, to feed the crowd's appetite, one cruel morsel at a time. First came the procession. Trumpets blared as soldiers marched through the gates, carrying banners that told the stories of Rome's victories. Behind them came exotic animals: bears from the north, crocodiles from Egypt, ostriches from Africa. Finally, the prisoners were brought out. Chained in groups, their heads were forced down, their bodies pushed forward by soldiers' spears. Each group represented a conquered people, displayed like exhibits in a living museum of Rome's supremacy. The announcers shouted their origins: the Africans, the Jews, the Gauls, the Dacians. The crowd jeered, hurling insults, laughter, and sometimes stones. Each name was not an introduction, but a condemnation, reducing entire peoples to caricatures for Roman amusement. This was not just about death, it was about identity, and the stripping away of it until nothing remained but humiliation. Then came the rituals of cruelty. To amuse the crowd before the executions, prisoners were forced into performances. Some were dressed as mythological monsters, while others played the roles of criminals in staged plays. Africans were chained. To animals, their struggles turned into mock battles. Jews were mocked with false altars, their faith turned into parody before their deaths. Celts were armed with wooden swords, forced to stumble through farcical duels where they could not defend themselves. Each act was designed not only to kill, but to send a message that these peoples were lesser, destined to be laughed at, tormented, and erased. And then, when the crowd's anticipation reached its peak, the real violence began. The gates beneath, the arena groaned as they rose, and from the shadows burst lions, wolves, and bears, driven into frenzy by hunger and whips. The prisoners, unarmed and trembling, were released into the sand. The screams that followed blended with the roars of the animals and the deafening cheers of the crowd. To the Romans, this was entertainment. To the captives, it was the end of everything. Blood stained the sand as animals lunged, claws tearing flesh, jaws crushing bone. Men and women tried to flee, but there was nowhere to run. Some fell to their knees, praying in languages the crowd did not understand. Others clutched one another, refusing to die alone. But every act of desperation was drowned in laughter and applause. For the Romans, the captives' suffering was proof of their superiority, the ultimate demonstration that the empire ruled not only with armies, but with terror. Yet even this horror was only the beginning. The Colosseum was designed with hidden machinery that could transform the arena floor into entire landscapes. With pulleys, trapdoors, and stagecraft, the sand could rise, sink, or flood. Prisoners were sometimes placed in mock forests, forced to play the role of prey hunted down by animals. At other times, the arena was filled with water, and captives were drowned in staged naval battles. Racism became theater on an unimaginable scale, where the lives of the marginalized were nothing but props in Rome's endless appetite for blood. Above, the crowd roared louder, their thirst for cruelty unquenchable. The nobles sipped wine as they pointed to the dying, and children laughed as prisoners begged for mercy. In this moment, the Colosseum was not just an arena, it was the empire itself, a mirror of Rome's soul. Every scream, every torn body, every humiliation was a reflection of the racism that kept Rome powerful. And so, as the sun reached its highest point and the first wave of captives lay broken in the sand, the crowd's appetite only grew. What they had witnessed was cruelty, yes, but in Rome, cruelty was never enough. The most brutal and inhumane acts, the ones that would scar history forever, were still to come. The first wave of executions was only the beginning. The arena floor, already soaked in blood, was raked over with fresh sand, covering the bodies, as if Rome could bury its sins with a thin veil of cleanliness. But the crowd was restless. Their voices rose in a chant demanding more. Rome's cruelty did not burn out, it grew stronger with every scream, every drop of blood spilled in the name of entertainment. The second spectacle began with fire. Prisoners were dragged into the arena and bound to tall wooden stakes. Oil was poured over their bodies, the stench of it rising into the air as soldiers set torches alight. The crowd cheered, not in horror but in delight, as human beings became living torches. Flames consumed flesh, and the cries of agony mingled with laughter echoing through the stone arches. To Rome, this was not an atrocity. It was theater. Each burning body was presented as punishment for rebels, but everyone knew the truth. These were captives, their only crime being the wrong race, the wrong faith, the wrong people conquered at the wrong time. Next came the crucifixions. The Colosseum was transformed into a forest of crosses, each one bearing the weight of a foreigner, condemned to die slowly. Africans, Jews, Celts, all raised high above the sand, their bodies stretched and broken, their suffering turned into a tableau of humiliation. The crowd jeered at their pain, pointing at their twisted forms as if they were nothing more than grotesque decorations. Hours passed, and still they hung, their slow death serving as a background for the games that continued around them. In Rome, death was never sacred. It was an accessory. The cruelty deepened with contests designed not for fairness, but for humiliation. Africans were thrown unarmed against lions, their dark skin deliberately juxtaposed with the beasts to reinforce the Roman fantasy that they were closer to animals than men. The crowd erupted as claws tore into flesh, as if the killing proved what the empire had always claimed, that Rome's enemies were subhuman. Others were forced into battles where they were denied weapons, handed wooden clubs against armored gladiators, ensuring that their deaths were as swift as they were pointless. But cruelty in Rome was never simple. The organizers of the games devised endless variations to prolong suffering. Some captives were tied together, two at a time, forced to stumble helplessly as wild dogs tore them apart. Others were dressed in costumes mocking their cultures. Celtic prisoners painted with false tattoos and feathers, Jewish captives paraded in parody of their own sacred rituals before being slaughtered. Every execution was carefully designed not only to kill, but to degrade, to erase dignity, to turn human lives into punchlines in Rome's grotesque theater. And the crowd, thousands of men, women and children, did not look away. They demanded more. What had once been shocking became routine. Blood no longer satisfied. They wanted creativity and cruelty. Each new execution had to surpass the last. This hunger was the engine of the Colosseum, a machine fueled by the normalization of racism and violence. Imagine the perspective of a captive waiting in the hypogum. Hearing the cheers above, they did not hear grief or pity. They heard celebration. The pain of those who died before them was drowned by applause, and they knew their own deaths would be met the same way. Some wept, some prayed, some stared into silence, already gone before the arena claimed them. For them, there was no escape. The cruelty without end was not an accident. it was the design of Rome itself. The empire needed these spectacles to remind its citizens of their supremacy. Every death was a lesson. Resist Rome and be destroyed, not only in body, but in spirit. To the prisoners, it was annihilation. To the Romans, it was entertainment. And to history, it was the darkest example of how racism and power can turn cruelty into tradition. But even as the day bled on and the executions piled higher, Rome's appetite was far from satisfied. The crowd demanded not only blood, but invention. The organizers prepared their most elaborate spectacles yet, acts so shocking, so calculated, in their brutality, that they would etch themselves into the memory of history. The cruelty had no end, and yet the worst was still to come. The Colosseum was not just a place of killing, it was a laboratory of cruelty. Rome's engineers, artists, and emperors combined their skills to design spectacles so elaborate that they blurred the line between theater and torture. By the second half of the games, the executions no longer resembled punishments. They became performances, crafted to etch Rome's supremacy into the minds of every spectator. The crowd had grown restless with repetition, beasts devouring captives, fires consuming bodies, crosses lining the sand. These horrors had become too familiar. The organizers needed something greater, and so they turned to invention. First came the myth reenactments. Rome prided itself on its stories of gods and heroes, but in the Colosseum, these tales were reenacted with human lives. Prisoners became unwilling actors, forced into roles that guaranteed their deaths. A man was strapped with wings of wax and feathers pushed high above the arena on a hidden platform. He played Icarus, condemned to fall as the sun melted his wings. But the fall was real. His body crashed onto the sand, bones shattering before the crowd's eyes. Others were chained to rocks, forced to embody Prometheus as vultures were released to tear into their flesh. Some played Hercules' foes, burned alive as the heroes' torches lit their bodies. Each myth became a script of cruelty, performed not with illusion, but with blood. The crowd roared not at artistry, but at reality, the pleasure of seeing foreigners die in roles meant to glorify Rome's gods and humiliate those who resisted its empire. Then came the machinery of death. Beneath the arena floor, Roman engineers had built an intricate system of pulleys, lifts, and trapdoors. With a signal, entire cages of animals could rise into the arena. The sand itself could open, swallowing prisoners whole. The arena could even flood, transformed into a shallow sea where naval battles were staged. But these were no games. They were executions disguised as spectacle. Prisoners were chained to rafts, forced to fight against each other as soldiers, on boats attacked from above. Drowning was slow, deliberate, and designed for the crowd's amusement. Others were tied to platforms that collapsed suddenly, plunging them into water as crocodiles and hippos were released. The audience laughed. As captives flailed helplessly, their final gasps lost beneath the roar of 50,000 voices. The cruelty did not stop at animals and water. Rome devised spectacles that blurred the line between man and beast. Prisoners were sewn into the hides of animals, lions, wolves, or even donkeys, and forced into the arena where starving dogs were unleashed. The crowd howled with laughter as the disguised victims were torn apart, their humanity erased by costume, their deaths turned into grotesque comedy. Racism was woven into every detail. Africans were often chosen for animal-based humiliations, reinforcing the stereotype that they were no more than beasts. Jews were given roles mocking their resistance to Rome's gods, their faith turned into spectacle before their deaths. Celts were forced into oversized armor and made to stumble clumsily, caricatures of savagery before being struck down. Every act reminded the crowd that Rome was civilized and its enemies were barbaric, unworthy of mercy. And the crowd devoured it all. Senators nodded in approval, nobles laughed, children cheered as men drowned or burned or were torn apart. The Colosseum had become a mirror of Rome's soul, reflecting not glory, but hunger, an appetite for cruelty that no blood could quench. But even these horrors were not enough. The emperors themselves sought spectacles that would outdo all others, displays so shocking they would be remembered forever. Rumors spread through the crowd of what was to come. Come? Some whispered of a spectacle involving hundreds of captives at once. Others spoke of acts so vile that even ancient writers hesitated to record them. The games had escalated beyond cruelty. They had become inventions of terror, crafted with precision, fueled by racism, and applauded by the world's most powerful empire. The captives had no illusions left. Death was certain. The only mystery was how Rome would choose to end them. And as the final preparations were made, as the machinery beneath the Colosseum groaned into place, and the crowd's chants shook the stone, one truth became clear. The climax was coming. Rome was ready to unveil its darkest spectacle, the one that would go too far, even for an empire built on blood. The air inside the Colosseum was different now. The chants of the crowd had grown louder, more feverish, as though 50,000 voices were caught in a storm of anticipation. The sand had been raked smooth, as if the arena were being prepared not just for another act, but for something monumental. Beneath the surface, in the dark passages of the Hypogeum, hundreds of captives waited, chained, starved, broken. They did not know what form their deaths would take. They only knew that the end was near. The signal was given. The great bronze doors swung open, and the captives were driven into the light. They came in waves, Africans dragged by chains, Jews, stripped of their clothing, Celts and Gauls marked with paint. The sheer number stunned even the crowd. Never before had so many been brought into the arena at once. They stumbled forward, their bare feet sinking into the sand, while above them the audience erupted in a frenzy of applause. Then the machinery groaned to life. Trap doors opened, platforms rose from beneath the earth. From one corner, cages of lions emerged, their roars shaking the stone arches. From another, packs of leopards and wolves. The crowd screamed in delight, but this was only the beginning. In the center of the arena, a massive wooden structure rose, a towering effigy of Rome's enemies, constructed like a grotesque stage set. Inside it, prisoners were bound, their cries muffled by the roar of the crowd. And then the fire began. Torches were thrown, and the effigy blazed to life. Flames engulfed the captives inside, their silhouettes writhing against the walls as the crowd watched in awe. The screams rose like a choir, carried into the open sky, but no one looked away. The fire was theater. The deaths were entertainment. Around the burning structure, chaos erupted. The cages opened, and beasts were unleashed into the crowd of captives. Lions lunged into the helpless masses, tearing flesh with ease. Wolves snapped, had throats. Leopards dragged bodies across the sand. The prisoners scattered in panic, but there was nowhere to run. Soldiers lined the edges of the arena, spears ready to drive them back into the killing ground. But Rome was not finished. From beneath the arena floor, another mechanism rose, a platform carrying a false ship surrounded by shallow water. Prisoners were herded aboard, chained to the deck, while others were forced into the water with no escape. Soldiers dressed as Roman heroes attacked, hacking the captives to pieces as the ship sank, drowning those still chained. The crowd roared, thrilled at the reenactment of a naval victory. For them, history was not taught in words. It was written in blood. And still the spectacle escalated. Prisoners were sewn into animal skins, mocked as beasts, and driven into the arena where hounds ripped them apart. Others were nailed to makeshift crosses and set ablaze while acrobats performed tricks around them, blending death with circus-like humor. The boundary between cruelty and performance collapsed completely. This was no longer punishment, no longer even symbolic. It was sadism elevated into ritual. The crowd cheered louder, but not all were unshaken. Among the nobles and senators, some turned their faces away, their stomachs churning at the sheer scale of the horror. Even hardened Romans whispered that this was excessive, that the games had crossed a line. For the first time, unease rippled through the Colosseum, not because of pity, but because the spectacle revealed something Rome could no longer deny. Its hunger for cruelty had no end. When the killing was finally done, the arena floor was unrecognizable. The sand was blackened with ash, slick with blood, littered with bodies torn apart by beasts or charred beyond recognition. Smoke rose into the air, carrying with it the stench of burning flesh. The prisoners had been annihilated, their humanity erased, their death staged as nothing more than entertainment. But the silence that followed was heavier than the applause that preceded it. Rome had given the crowd everything they demanded. And yet, what remained was not triumph, but a haunting sense that something had gone too far. Even in an empire, built on conquest and blood, there were limits. And on that day, in that arena, Rome had shattered them. The climax was over, but the shadow it cast would linger for centuries. When the fires in the Colosseum finally burned out, when the beasts were caged and the bodies dragged away, Rome returned to silence. The sand was once again smoothed, the stage reset as if nothing had happened. But for those who lived it, for those who watched it, and for those who perished in it, the day would never be erased. The survivors, few though they were, did not return home as men. They returned as warnings. Scarred, crippled, humiliated, they were paraded through the streets as living proof of Rome's dominance. To the empire, they were not human beings. They were reminders that defiance came at a cost, that entire peoples could be broken in both body and spirit. Racism was not an accident here, it was policy, embedded into the very theater of Rome's power. But what of the crowd? 50,000 Romans left the Colosseum that day with blood on their minds. For many, the horrors they witnessed only deepened their hunger. They had seen the boundaries pushed further than ever before, and some wondered what new spectacles the next games would bring. For others, though, there was unease. They had watched hundreds burned, drowned, torn apart, humiliated. Some felt the creeping realization that cruelty once unleashed has no limit. If Rome could do this to foreigners, could it not one day turn inward, devouring its own people? Indeed, history would prove them right. The same arena that humiliated Africans, Jews, Celts, and countless others would one day become a place where Romans themselves, political enemies, dissidents, even emperors, were executed in front of cheering crowds. What began as racial violence expanded into a culture of spectacle until cruelty became so normalized that no one was safe. Racism was the foundation, but bloodlust was the legacy. For the captives, their stories were buried with them. They left no monuments, no records, no voices to tell their side. All that remains are fragments, accounts written by Roman historians who saw them not as victims, but as curiosities. And yet, even in those biased words, the truth bleeds through. The scale of suffering was so immense, so inhumane, that it cannot be fully hidden by propaganda. Rome believed the games glorified its empire. In reality, they revealed its rot. Behind the marble facades and golden statues, behind the myths of civilization and order, there was only cruelty dressed as culture. The Colosseum was not a monument to Rome's greatness. It was a monument to Rome's fears, its need to dominate, to humiliate, to remind itself of its superiority at the expense of others. And that truth lingers. When we walk through the ruins today, tourists marvel at the arches and stonework. Few pause to imagine the screams that once filled the air, the rivers of blood that once stained the sand. The Colosseum is sold as history's wonder, but rarely as history's warning. The aftermath of blood is not silence, it is memory. And memory, if ignored, repeats itself.